Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that true reconciliation requires a treaty. I invite George Williams to address this House with his arguments for the affirmative.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this important topic. And I want to start by recognising that a treaty is not something we need to be scared of. It's not something that's going to radically change the way we do government in this country. It indeed is the accepted way that countries around the world reach a settlement with their Indigenous peoples. It's the way that those countries achieve justice, those countries address grievances, and those countries also lay a better path for moving forward. Indeed, if you look around the world, treaties are just stock standard in those other countries. Countries like the United States, Canada, New Zealand all have treaties. And they have treaties because they see those as the right way of addressing these types of problems. Indeed, the treaty debate isn't just an old one in those countries. Canada is still in the midst of making new treaties, recognising that where groups, Aboriginal groups, have been bypassed in the treaty-making process, that they now need to be included through modern treaties. Now, that's the standard way these issues are dealt with. Australia is different. Our legal system is the exception. We're the only Commonwealth nation that does not have any form of treaties with our Aboriginal peoples. Instead, what we have is a legal system that's actually been built and designed quite deliberately to exclude Aboriginal people and to discriminate against them. And to understand how we got that system and why we don't have a treaty in this country, we need to go back to actually understand how this nation was brought about and how it was that Aboriginal people were deliberately excluded. We got a new constitution in 1901, and that was the document that brought about the country of Australia. And that constitution was drafted at two major conventions in the 1890s. And if you were to ask what role did Aboriginal people play in the decisions that created this nation at those conventions, the answer is none. They were deliberately excluded, they were not represented, and they were not consulted. Indeed, Aboriginal people in the 1890s, in creating this foundation of our nation today, what we got instead of a treaty, were instead cast, in the words of the time, as a dying race. It was said that what we needed to do was smooth the dying pillow of Aboriginal people. Our nation was built upon the idea of Terra, Nullius, that offensive notion that this country was simply no man's land when white settlers arrived in 1788, that there were no people here at that time. So what we got was a constitution and a nation that was built upon the idea that our system of government should exclude Aboriginal people. They were not thought to have any long-term future in this nation. They weren't to be given rights. They weren't even to be given a voice, even in their own affairs. And this is reflected in the legal system we did get in 1901. Our constitution opens with words that explains our history, how we got here, where we're seeking to go to. But those words make no mention whatsoever of Aboriginal people. It's as if our whole system of government is based upon the idea that simply nothing happened prior to 1788 that needs to be reflected in what we do today. We've got another clause in the Constitution, section 25, called races disqualified from voting. It's still there today, and it's written on the basis that it's okay to stop Aboriginal people casting a vote in state elections. Another clause, the races power, was put there to enable areas to be reserved for whites, to provide that people could be removed from certain areas because of the colour of their skin. They could be denied certain jobs. And we have this clause in our foundational law, in the words of Sir Edmund Barton, our first Prime Minister, to allow the federal parliament to regulate the affairs of the people of the coloured and inferior races in the Commonwealth. What was said back then is we needed a legal system that made it clear that laws could be passed to discriminate against, and I quote, Hindus, Chinamen and other barbarians. Now, this is the legal foundation upon which our nation was built, and it shouldn't come as any surprise. This was the era of the White Australia policy. This was the era in which we had many laws on the books that did discriminate against people on the basis of our race. The problem is that we still have a legal system that enables those things to occur. We still have a constitution that denies people the vote, possibly on the basis of their race. A racist power that means people can be subject to different laws because of the colour of their skin. And indeed, we've had laws and policies more recently in areas such as native title and the Northern Territory intervention that take advantage of those possibilities. Now, given that history, it simply shouldn't come as any surprise that Australia, alone among comparable nations, didn't take the steps to negotiate a treaty with Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders. What we did instead was a path of exclusion and discrimination. And for me, the question is now, many decades later, can we actually take the steps that, frankly, we should have taken more than a century ago? Can we actually enter into negotiations with Aboriginal people on the basis of mutual respect to enter into agreements that actually recognise their worth, their history, their grievances, and to do so in a way that builds a platform for the future, not only for Aboriginal people, but for Australia as a united nation? Now, a treaty itself is nothing more than an agreement. It's a political agreement reached between groups. It could be called a makarrata or a compact, and indeed these agreements have many different names in different countries. But a treaty itself would be a starting point for acknowledgement. It would provide a process of negotiation, and would also provide a platform for rights, obligations, and, we would hope, economic prosperity. Now, I mention economic prosperity because treaties aren't just about recognition and justice, even though that's at the heart of what these instruments are about. But they are also about economic prosperity, because all of the evidence suggests that if you want to build Aboriginal communities, if you actually want to empower people, then you need to enter into partnerships and treaties that give Aboriginal people control and sovereignty over their own lives. This is the most important finding of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, a project that's run for decades and looked at hundreds of studies across America and elsewhere and asked the question, what helps Aboriginal and Indigenous communities build responsible, effective communities and communities that are underpinned by effective economic development? The finding of that project is that there's a necessary condition to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples in America and elsewhere, and that necessary condition is that Aboriginal people must be given a measure, a level of control over their own lives. It's not possible to impose success upon Aboriginal people. You can't make decisions for Aboriginal people and expect those decisions to stick. Instead, we actually need to make changes to how we're governed to give Aboriginal people the power and the responsibility, not only for the successes that might follow, but also for the mistakes and the wrong turns. And indeed, a treaty is the way that we would achieve these things. The powerlessness that Aboriginal people so often feel in the face of things like the Northern Territory intervention is a symptom of the fact that we have a system built upon their exclusion. It's a symptom of the fact that, more often than not, laws have been made for Aboriginal people by parliaments without even one Aboriginal person sitting in those chambers. Unlike places like New Zealand, Canada and the United States, we don't recognise the sovereignty of Aboriginal peoples. We don't recognise their ability and capacity to make decisions about themselves and their families. We do need a treaty because it's the way that we can change that system, change the system based upon imposing outcomes from Canberra to actually giving Aboriginal people the power to make decisions for themselves. Now, the finding of the Harvard American Project was simple. It found that when it looked across all of its studies, when Aboriginal people were given the power through treaties, that they outperformed decision makers from external agencies. That Aboriginal people made decisions at lower cost, saving taxpayers money, and also decisions that were more effective in dealing with alcohol abuse and a range of other problems. My argument is not that a treaty is a panacea. I'd simply say it's part of the fix that we need in this country. It's one piece of the puzzle. It's one thing that needs to be done to actually achieve justice, recognition and prosperity. And I want to finish here with not words of my own, but actually words of Tony Abbott on this issue, an unlikely supporter perhaps of these issues, but he spoke about these matters last year in Parliament on an act of recognition. What he said was, Australia is a blessed country. Our climate, our land, our people, our institutions rightly make us the envy of the earth, except for one thing. We have never fully made peace with the first Australians. This is a stain on our soul that Prime Minister Keating so movingly evoked at Redfern 21 years ago. We have to acknowledge that pre-1788 this land was Aboriginal then as it is Australian now, and until we have acknowledged that, we will be an incomplete nation and a torn people. We only have to look across the Tasman to see how it all could have been done so much better. Thanks to the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, two peoples became one nation. Now, I think Tony Abbott got it right when he said that, and if Tony Abbott can recognise the worth of a treaty, then perhaps you can too. And perhaps we can recognise that even though treaties are not perfect, even though they come with their own problems, I think that it is the case that if we want to achieve true reconciliation in this country, then a treaty is one of the things that we must do. Thank you.
You might have got the impression from what George said that the governments of the United States, Canada and New Zealand all have a treaty with all Indigenous people in their nations. This is not true. Not even the Treaty of Waitangi covered all Maori people. It only covered those of the North Island, and some of the chiefs there refused to sign. In the case of North America, all of those treaties, as I understand it, are with particular named groups. And that's the kind of treaty we already have in this country at regional levels. We have around 800 regional agreements in which Aboriginal people, usually defined as the traditional owners or the native title holders, are signatories to joint arrangements with usually state government, a mining company, the Commercial Fishermen's Association or Fishers Association, shire councils and other interest groups. So the question here is, since we already have all these localised treaties, some of which are worth millions of dollars, the most recently cancelled one was worth billions, why are we talking about a treaty when there has been so much progress at ground level? You know, 20% of this whole country is covered in treaties, which George, who's the expert on this, just told us correctly, I'm sure, that they are an agreement by any other name is a treaty. The number is growing. There's many in the pipeline. If you want to see them and maps of the whole country showing them, just get onto the National Native Title Tribunal website. They're listed there. Interestingly, 39% of South Australia is covered in these agreements. Roughly 20 to 40 or 50%, no, 20 to 40% covers most of the states. The odd ones out of Tasmania, where there are no agreements, and New South Wales, where there's only 1.2% of the land surface covered by these agreements. Victoria has a much higher proportion of its surface area covered by these regional agreements. So there is, in a sense, no post-colonial British Empire standard for having a national, all-inclusive Indigenous signatory in these agreements. And one of the things that such a universal agreement would do would be to reinforce the notion of race as a legal status in the fabric of the country's legal system. Now, the reason why people get to sign up in the Kimberleys or Cape York or South Australia or Victoria as traditional owners or as native title holders, yes, initially it's because of their ancestry as Aboriginal people, but that's not enough. They've got to be from the region. They've got to have a real stake. Their kids are going to grow up there. They expect their grandchildren to deal with this area. Their lives are intertwined with those of others in the area. They may share ancestry with the local pastoralists. Aboriginal people may be the local pastoralists. In the Wick case, for example, I was involved in this, so don't get me wrong, I'm not against treaties. I'm heartily in favour of regional agreements. We worked for 20 years on that case from 1992 until October last year. This agreement was incredibly complex. It involved well over 1,000 traditional owners with 125 clan countries, a large number of different languages. The land tenures included pastoral lease, old mission block, and so on. Waters were involved, so the Commonwealth was also a participatory element in this case. What happened there was a lot of blood, sweat and tears. There was a lot of resistance. The last ones to hold out were the non-Indigenous pastoral interests. But in the end, they did all sign up. A treaty is an exchange. It's not a gift. Each party gives up something. The treaties in North America typically involve people handing over land or the right to use land in exchange for money or goods, plus a package, maybe a medicine chest, for example, which in modern terms is interpreted as special health care or earmarked health care. But there's always an exchange. So at the local and regional level, those events which are ongoing every day out there, which are involving people in actually improving their rights, their legal rights in country, because quite often the people are not regarded as native title holders until by agreement the development of the proposal, which is to involve all the people with a real stakeholding, part of the deal may be, okay, you recognise that we are the owners of the land. Argyle Diamonds, a huge agreement covering a large area of land. It used to be Lissadell Station. I worked on this case as well in a sort of ambient way. That involved 4 different language groups on the Aboriginal side, a very, very large international mining company, the state government of Western Australia, and part of the deal is that the company has to regard the traditional owners as the landlords. And the benefit of that, you can imagine, in the diamond industry is massive. And that isn't just a matter of handing over money. These regional agreements, the bigger ones, usually involve an employment deal for Aboriginal people, involvement in land management and species management at the level of decision making, not just as people who go out and kick over the feral plants. It involves heritage protection, for example, sacred site protection and monitoring, and so on. They're complex deals. But what they do is they engage people in the future. They do not simply try to settle the past. Reconciliation. I've written about this in my book, The Politics of Suffering. It's the last chapter, and the chapter's called On Feeling Reconciled. I make a distinction between reconciliation with a capital R, which is proposed frequently as a kind of quasi-legal bureaucratic resolution of some kind at a great national level, which is essentially couched in terms of a deal between races, which again I warn, be careful what you wish for. Think of other countries where they have introduced legislation to define race within the country. Nuremberg 1933 horrifically comes to mind straight away. So I warn people about that, partly because we can't assume the goodwill of everyone 100 years from now. So getting the groundwork in place now to prevent the breakdown of what is really a fragile but fabulous unity of a country of this kind. And I know it's not unified at all levels, and I know there are deep divisions. Nevertheless, try Lebanon. Ding. Okay. So what can people who don't have an immediate, direct, personal contact with Indigenous people do about these things? They may not be involved in a treaty because they live in the suburbs of a large city and there's no treaty being proposed for that area. What can they do about reconciliation if they don't have Aboriginal neighbours or friends or relatives? Pinning your hopes on a national contract, a pact signed in Canberra with handshakes and a media conference, I think is a compact with feet of clay if you really want moral satisfaction. The state cannot do your morals for you. The state cannot salve your conscience for you. And a contract on paper cannot remake the past. And those living cannot undo the crimes of those who are dead. So to be positive, if people want reconciliation on a national scale, my best recommendation is learn what you can, as much as you can, about Aboriginal people and their history. Go and learn a language. It's not hard. Get connected if you must. but above all, resolve the issues in your own conscience and with yourself.
Mark Yettica-Paulson.
Am I entitled to speak about treaty? Do I have the right to engage on this debate? Can I speak about treaty without legal training? When you sit between the likes of George and Dr. Dodson, these things weigh on your mind. And I was really pressed thinking about how can I find my voice, not only on the stage sharing the affirmative team, but also sharing the stage with other esteemed colleagues. But mine is the voice of thinking Australians. Australians who want to know, does this make sense? How does this fit? How does this affect our national consciousness? And how does this affect me? Will this improve anything? Will it make it any better for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and for us as Australians? So using that voice, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which we speak. I want to acknowledge as a visitor to this beautiful country of the Wurundjeri and the Kulin Nation, I've enjoyed my time here in Melbourne, but I am returning back home to where my family is, up in sunny Queensland. I say that though, the weather ride here has been amazing. I'm going back to boring old sunshine, whereas in Melbourne you get to have it all in one day. So it's an old joke, but that's the joke that I keep using. I want to talk to you tonight with the voice, the universal voice of the T-shirt slogan. If I was wearing a T-shirt for this debate, the T-shirt that I want to present to you for this first part is "Treaty is not a dirty word." We should not be afraid of treaty. We shouldn't run from the word, we shouldn't flee from the idea, and we shouldn't shun those who present it, those who continue to hold that flame of treaty and continue to hold our attention about its importance for us. Treaty can help all of us, and reconciliation is about all of us. Treaty is not an act of benevolence, a magnanimous act by the majority to the unsatisfied and unwelcoming minority. It's not an act of concession or, here you go, you can take this. Treaty is an act of reconciliation. It can outline important sets of responsibilities, standards and entitlements that can help improve all of our relationships. Treaty is an act of recognition. It can hold our checkered past and acknowledge the overall journey that we have travelled together. It can be used as an instrument to acknowledge our past and set principles for us to act now to create a better shared future. Treaty is an act of restoration. It can not only hold our checkered past, but it can cradle our most vulnerable part of our nation's history. And that is the story of our origin. George spoke to you about how when the idea of Australia being put together was created and when they were having constitutional conversations about how we were going to federate all of us here, they were conversations that didn't include Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. We have a beautiful, beautiful country, a country that is the envy of nations, prosperous, peaceful and safe. Not everyone enjoys all that Australia has to offer though, and we should never forget that. Sir William Dean, when he was Governor-General, continued to remind us that we will be measured by the treatment of our most marginalised. However, we do have a powerful story that is amazing, the way that we have created this wondrous country. We should be very proud to be part of this country. But our weak spot is our story of origin. Our weak point, where we start to wince and cringe and go, that wasn't right, was our story of origin. Treaty can help us restore, correct, and heal that story of origin. Now, in modern times, we don't value long memory. We've inherited institutions and we can't even tell you where they come from. We don't even know why the things are the way they are. It's not a very common Aussie conversation to talk about how things all started way back when. And the idea of treaty restoring the story of origin can, for some Australians, go, well, what's the point? I don't get it. But we do know that it's important to remember. We know that it's important to highlight our journey and the journey that we've had together, because it shapes our identity. It shapes who we are. It shapes how we name ourselves. Events like Anzac, Remembrance Day, Reconciliation Week, commemorative days of triumph and tragedy help shape the way we understand our identity. But let's be clear, Australia's story of origin is broken. Our settlement of this land in the late 1700s was not honourable. We haven't resolved that fact. That fact has come back to us again and again. We have not restored the honour on that fact. And when the Constitution was being written, that fact had raised itself, and we enshrined in our Constitution that broken fact of the story of origin, and we are now trying to fix that. But an agreement on the settlement and clarity of the settlement of the land will help reconciliation. Treaty is not a dirty word to run from. It's a deadly word to run to. It offers a platform for all of us as Australians to restore our pride and honour in the national story of origin. But we cannot make progress on this if we get caught in the polarised positions. So my next T-shirt, if I could magically change my T-shirt in front of you, the T-shirt would read, "I will not be polarised." One of the challenges in working in a space where Indigenous and other Australians want to work together is that you can get caught in the polarised positions. And the treaty work is no exception to this. Treaty has been repositioned from extreme ends of the polarised positions, and it's always been positioned away from reconciliation. As long as we keep it that way, we're neglecting a cornerstone of fixing a fundamental part of our national story. But we can't be seduced into the polarised positions, because we know that they are tools for division. We know that they set up a dynamic that says you're either fully for me or you're fully against me. Polarised positions create drama. They create a great spectacle for us to read and us to follow. It gives good stuff for popular consumption and it stirs up energy. But polarised positions aren't all bad. Tonight we have an example of polarised positions for us to try and get more knowledge, for us to try and find out exactly what's going on for all of us as Australians. But we can't be seduced into the right and wrong, black and white, win and lose. We need to hold the work of treaty in front of us and maintain its presence there so that we don't get lost in our pursuit of all other kinds of reconciliation and neglect a cornerstone of our national identity. Does the work of reconciliation require a treaty? Absolutely it does. Because it can restore our honour for our national story of origin, and its ever-presence in our work can help us navigate through the seductive play and popularist way of presenting Indigenous affairs as polarised positions. A treaty can cement our belonging together. Thank you.
Tony Birch.
You're such an easy crowd, aren't you, that Mark flatters you with the weather, Melbourne weather, and he softens you. Very smart move there, Mark. What I do want to say, and I do want to say something in agreement with Mark. It doesn't matter to me how you vote tonight, because I think I want to recognise how much the Wheeler Centre has done for blackfellas in this state to include us in public debate, to include us in intellectual discussion. And we're all going to leave here tonight a lot richer because of that commitment from the Wheeler Centre, and I'm sure we're going to leave here enriched and with a lot to think about. I do want to say that for me this is not a debate about the validity of a treaty. I do believe that a treaty can have both real and symbolic value. If it only has symbolic value, of course, it could become watered down or meaningless when we consider some of the other sort of slogans or badges that federal governments and state governments sometimes enact to feel that they have dealt adequately with the rights of Aboriginal people. And of course, as I said, it could have proper legal ramifications, but I don't think that this is what we're here to discuss. We need to recognise before this to know that the other issue with a treaty, like native title, it is limiting. It is not land rights. And we have found as Aboriginal people that while there's been a lot of celebration and some wonderful work done in the area of native title, it is still limiting and it is not land rights. I'm interested in the possibility and the potential of reconciliation that goes beyond any sloganeering, that goes beyond any capital R reconciliation that was already mentioned. I'm interested in a philosophical approach to relations between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people which can actually affect a change in mindset, a change in the national psyche about our relationships with each other. It's a big question and a big ask, but I believe unless we can achieve this, unless we work towards this deep conviction, many of the other things that are being discussed here and the things that are being worked on very seriously will never come to proper fulfilment because we don't have a sense of who we are to enable us to proceed further. So I'm interested in a notion of reconciliation which has a deep moral, philosophical and spiritual conviction and basis to it. I'm interested in a form of reconciliation that is not contingent on any supplementary clause, be it a treaty or anything else. In fact, I think the integrity of true reconciliation can be hampered if we actually align it to some other so-called real outcome. The real outcome is the way that we can change our thinking and the way that we can be a better people. So I believe in a true reconciliation that is achievable, that has deep altruistic conviction at its base. And I believe in a reconciliation that is founded in its own intrinsic value, not in its instrumental value. Now, I'm not naive and I'm not fundamentally idealistic in any way. What I believe, if we can have that shift in mindset, if we can think much more deeply and philosophically about these issues, then the instrumental outcomes of that thinking and that change of mindset would flow. So if we are to think about something like a treaty and the difficulty of making it something real, to make it something tangible, we cannot do that with the current state of our political psyche. If we look at our inability not only to discuss relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, if we think about the so-called debate around how we treat asylum seekers, if we think about the so-called debate around global warming and climate change, we deal with these issues with such shallowness because we are not working as a deep thinking country. And if we are to make fundamental change, we need to become a thinking country, and a way of considering this issue of reconciliation, I think, is something that could help us move toward it. The other thing I want to say is that true reconciliation is not a 21st century institutional buzzword. It is a term that I think that has been used and sometimes abused by politicians. It is a word that has become commodified on T-shirts, not Mark's T-shirt, but on T-shirts. This is the form of reconciliation that we don't need. It is momentary, it is around product, and it is around a feel-good sense of oneself that doesn't ask people to think about their long-term shift, their long-term change. One of the ways that we could understand the depth of quality of reconciliation is actually to think about something that's not discussed enough. Reconciliation is a historical reality. Reconciliation has occurred throughout periods of contact between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people at the local and real level. It has occurred in the most seemingly inequitable situations. It has occurred when those who have decided and had the ability to reconcile with each other have had so much to lose by reconciling their differences. As one example of this, two remarkable men, the Wurundjeri leader William Barrack, incarcerated at Corranderk Reserve near today's Healesville, when his people seemingly were the most disempowered they had been since the arrival of Europeans in Wurundjeri country. He meets a man called John Green, who is the manager of that reserve. And these two men, because they want the world to change, they want a better life for their people, decide that they must reconcile as two individuals and therefore bring their communities together. And for a great moment they did that. They did that because of their strength of conviction, their spiritual and their intellectual beliefs. When John Green said in the 1881 inquiry on Corranderk, a royal commission held here at the State Parliament, "These men are my brothers," it was seen as an outrage and a shocking example of someone treating Aboriginal men and women equitably. But he did it. And what those two men did and what those two communities did, to me, is the sort of model that we could and should work towards. The other issue I want to say just before closing is something of equal importance to me. In Wurundjeri country, we have a notion of what is called Tandarum, and that is a legal and cultural system of belief of use of country, that the host nation of that country is a nation that offers sanctuary and support and sustenance to visitors. And when you think about that, and when you think about the way that Aboriginal people live in this country today, the Wurundjeri people never ceded sovereignty to non-Aboriginal people, and the notion of Tandarum still stands for those people, so that if we think about a treaty, we need to think about it in a way that must come after a notion of settlement between each other as nations that is not legal, that is cultural. So that when non-Aboriginal people come to speak with Aboriginal people, they come to speak with Aboriginal people as hosts and owners of that country that is not given formal recognition in the first place by non-Aboriginal people, that is ascribed and stated and accepted through the voices of Aboriginal people. So in other words, that Aboriginal people do not and should not need a legal treaty to have sovereignty recognised. The other thing that I would like to say, and this is the final thing I want to say, is that reconciliation in its deepest sense, highlights a shared sense of community, and it highlights a shared sense of common humanity. And if we don't have that, I think all of these wishes for treaty, all of these desires that we want to bring us together, or in a more equitable sense, they cannot occur unless we have that philosophical basis to ourselves as a community in our hearts and in our minds. Thank you very much.
Mick Dodson.
Naji Gurdon, good evening. Someone's left their watch here. It's a nice watch. I might steal it. Because essentially that's what I want to talk about tonight, is theft. Firstly, I agree with most of what the previous speakers have said about reconciliation, although I think it's not a thing that's going to have an end point. I think it's a process that will be taken up generation by generation. Generations who set their own terms and conditions of the relationship. I also believe in a treaty. As we know, it's a compact or an agreement. There is a blueprint produced by the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation that's never been implemented. It includes a draft bill for the Parliament. So we don't have to start from scratch. And as Peter Sutton has said, And I agree with him on one point, and that is we've had a lot of practice of agreement making. But those agreements don't deal with some fundamental things. There are hundreds of them, but they do not deal with a fundamental political question, namely the political status in this country of the first Australians, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Nor do they deal with what I call the unfinished business. They rarely deal with questions of the past or present discord or divisions that we as a nation, as two peoples in a sense, sharing the same place, need to resolve. And they don't unpeel the layers, the historical layers of the colonial legacy. They do in part recognise the continuing cultural traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but they don't recognise that modern Australia has been built on removing the continent's resource wealth from Indigenous ownership and control. And they don't deal with the settler hostility to Indigenous peoples that bubbles beneath the surface of Australian civil society. And nor do they deal with the underlying sentiments that give rise to various public policy approaches, from extermination to protection to absorption to assimilation. And assimilation needs to be dealt with because the dominant society, in the dominant society, to us it reflects contempt for Indigenous society and culture. And these agreements don't provide a resolution to the injustice that peppers the settler nation's history. So the resolution of unfinished business is in two parts. Firstly, the British came here, invaded the country, took it from us without our consent. That was wrong, and it's never been addressed adequately, properly. A treaty can do that. And as a nation, we must recognise the truths of this history. And we have to jointly address the problem. We have to create the dialogue, and we have to move forward together in partnership. We do this with a listening heart. We come to it with a good heart. Now, the British, when they arrived, relied on Terra Nullius, part and parcel of the doctrine of discovery, which was developed by the Europeans and refined later by the Americans. Now, we never got the chance to espouse our doctrines of ownership of this land, nor to support our institutional ways and the basis of our occupation. And as I said, no consent was obtained or given, and the British used Terra Nullius to legitimate their sovereignty and totally ignored ours. Now, some say the Mabo decision overturned this massive, big lie. I wonder who's used that term before. That is Terra Nullius. But it did not deal with the question of the invasion of our lands and the taking of them without our consent. Nor did it deal with our political status. And the settler state, through its courts, have said it's beyond them to deal with the matter of Indigenous sovereignty. Now, this doesn't end the matter for us. In the hearts and minds of many Aboriginal nations, sovereignty and treaty remain very much live issues. My people, the Yarru, never ceded our sovereignty. And to say otherwise is to deny what we call the Bulgariara, the supreme source of our sovereignty. I know this because of who I am and where I come from. And to say otherwise would be an untruth. And like where we sit, the Yarru, many Aboriginal people sit. We live every day the unfinished business. A treaty can deal with that. And again, to quote Tony Abbott, this will help remove the stain on our souls. Galia Mabo, thank you.
Greg Phillips.
In acknowledging the Wurundjeri and traditional owners all over the country, I'd like to suggest that while this is an important and critical act, it is in fact a token if we don't enact dual sovereignty as well. I'd like to thank the many elders and mentors who have taught me much of what I'll share tonight, Professor Dodson among them. Something is on the nose in the state of Australia. There's a faint but very real stench. Though we might acknowledge and even apologise as a nation, there's a fundamental power imbalance built into Australian statehood. Reconciliation without the truth is rubbish. A treaty without dual sovereignty is trash. And constitutional recognition without rights is foolish. Let me explain how this dynamic plays out in Australia. Reconciliation at the moment in Australia is based on a false notion of inclusion, that white people will always own the state and that we should, as Aboriginal people, be thankful to be included in it. It is a white polite version of history where the truth never gets discussed and we all just get to move on. The reconciliation movement at the moment seems to be more concerned about corporate do-gooding rather than looking at the causes of the actual terrible statistics or about discussing truth. It's based on a false notion that if Aboriginal people all just get good jobs, everything will be okay. Of course, I agree that race relations must be improved, absolutely. But if we're honest about what really happened in this country, we should more correctly be talking about peacemaking. Peacemaking refers to what happens when you overcome and heal from war and genocide. Why are we so scared to use those words in the Australian context when clearly that's what's happened? Now, while I agree with the basic goals of a treaty acknowledging sovereignty between two equal parties, this can't be achieved if the one party is subsumed into the apparatus of the other, thereby reinforcing rather than redressing the fundamental power imbalance. And this is what's happened in New Zealand, Canada and the United States. Treaties are important, but they alone cannot improve outcomes because the more powerful party, the nation state, simply chooses to ignore them. The real issue here, my friends, is whiteness. I don't mean white people or ethnically or skin colour white. I mean a mindset. The mindset of power, of privilege, and that white values are always right. This is the mindset of colonisation, and it's still here with us. This is the kind of thinking where a nation can, on the one hand, apologise and give a heartfelt apology, and on the other hand, implement the debacle that is the Northern Territory intervention. Because under whiteness's terms, black people can't think for themselves. Of course we're all drunkards, of course we're all violent and abusers, and of course we can't do it for ourselves. Because there's no alcohol, violence or gambling problems in King Street on a Friday night in Melbourne, is there? Now, dealing with child abuse absolutely should be a national priority, but not in a way where you focus on only one race or in a way where you send in the military to deal with sexual abuse. From what we know about the ADF and sexual violence, I think that's a bit disingenuous, don't you think? My friends, whiteness is the issue. The values of whiteness allow a fundamental power imbalance to go unchecked, unsaid, as if it's normal and as if it's how it should be. That the state sets the parameters for how everyone else should interact, but the state has got a stench about it, my friends. Now, things like closing the gap in employment covenants, while they're very worthy policies and strategies, without also negotiating the inherent values, beliefs and power imbalances that are implicit in them, it's rubbish. Now, Marcia Langton's running around the country telling everyone that mining companies are our best friends just because they hand out a couple of traineeships and a few jobs, and we're supposed to be thankful for being included in the real economy. Give me a bloody break. If we're serious about redressing the power imbalance, we should be talking about 2.5% of GDP, the fat of the land and seas being put in a trust for Aboriginal health, housing and education. That would be real power sharing. The fund like that could be managed by Aboriginal accountants and fund managers. Now, historically, we've missed two very important opportunities to redress this fundamental power imbalance and to implement dual sovereignty. The first was in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, where Uncle Joe McGuinness, that lion of Aboriginal rights, said that he proposed an Aboriginal parliament. Now, I don't want to get hung up on the details of that proposal or the for and against, but his fundamental point was that Aboriginal people should be equal negotiating parties and there should be equal statehood implicit in any agreement of that nature. But instead we got included, and we're supposed to be thankful for being counted in the census, not as flora and fauna anymore. Now, secondly, when Eddie Mabo and others won the High Court challenge, instead of Keating and the Aboriginal negotiators at the time working through sensibly to a system of dual sovereignty, we are supposed to be thankful for being included in Australian common law. Well, a fat lot of good native title's done us. All it means is that Aboriginal people get to prove ourselves all the time on the terms of the white state. We get to tear our families and communities apart, proving who's more real under whiteness's terms. And we get included in a way that reifies white power rather than redresses it. Now, I do acknowledge and honour those who made their contributions in that debate. There were very serious time constraints on them and systemic constraints. But why do we always accept those time and systemic constraints as a given? On whose terms are Aboriginal people being included? Whose interests are really being served? When do we as a nation sit back and look at the fundamental changes to the terms of Australian governance that are required for all citizens? The current system of government is broken for white people too. If you look at the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, all of our systems are electorally split down the line. Our citizenry cannot agree. I'm sick, the public is sick of the false dualism of the left-right divide. We're sick of the corporations and Rupert Murdoch having more say than they should. Effectively now, we have a system of capitalist oligarchy, not participatory democracy. This is an issue that affects all of us, but particularly affects Aboriginal peoples. Uncle Joe McGuinness said the Westminster system is primitive, and by God, he was right. But there are real solutions. We have the perfect opportunity in negotiating a new republic, to negotiate a new founding document, to remake the state in the eyes of its citizens. Like our forebears who peacefully negotiated the Constitution, why don't we implement a peacemaking process, not reconciliation, a peacemaking process where we talk about the truth. When we deal with that great stain on our national character, then we can move past it. Then we can build a system of dual sovereignty, a system where Western participatory democracy and the traditions and richness of the newer Australians are also built in. Specifically, I'd like to propose the following: that we have citizenship participation in pre-selecting candidates in all parties, in parliamentary budgets and expenditure review processes; that we always have an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander president of the new republic. This would be a great way of both tangibly sharing power and symbolically presenting confidence and pride in our new national identity. Now, of course, we'd still have a regular parliament and prime minister as we do now, who would run with the regular business of the day, and Aboriginal people should be free to run for election in that parliament. But we should also have an Aboriginal parliament or some similar infrastructure which allows sensible policy debates in this area to be engaged. New Australians, when they come to Australia, shouldn't get their citizenship just from a local MP. They should get it from an Aboriginal elder, because it's our country. We share it with non-Aboriginal Australia now, and these two equally sovereign parties should be welcoming new people to the country. And why aren't we talking about the 2.5% of GDP trust I mentioned before? We're not even having these conversations. We're stuck in this very small-minded discussion about, oh, the system is just how it is, you just have to work within the system and go incrementally. We're hoping with hollow aspiration that one day whiteness will share power of its own accord. But this is not going to deal with the stench in the Australian state. This country can only be a truly global power. We can only credibly deal with Asia and be competitive in Asia and China on our own stands as a proud nation if we deal with this, if we deal with these issues and develop a vision. There's no political vision in the country for all peoples in all kinds of ways. In conclusion, reconciliations and treaties, while in and of themselves are important goals, if there are not two equally sovereign parties negotiating them, then they don't address fundamental power imbalance. My wise mother has said true reconciliation occurs when there is the right heart. At the moment, we have benevolence, charity and power imbalance dressed up as inclusion, and we have whiteness and racism dressed up as reconciliation. We do not have the right heart, but we do have a beautiful opportunity. We can act from the right heart. We can forge a proud new national identity in a new republic. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, survival in this rugged land means it is essential and required work.
A big thank you to all 6 of our speakers for those terrific presentations. It's now your chance to rise to the occasion and meet that quality with your own, which is always how it happens. The house lights are going to come up and you'll see there's 2 fixed microphones in the aisles. If you could make your way to those to make your contribution. If you're too scared to do that, you can do it via Twitter. The hashtag again is #IQ2Oz, but stand up and add your voice to this important conversation. You may want to speak for the motion, you may want to speak against it, you may want to give a comment, ask a question. All we ask is that you stay respectful, keep it to a minute, and kick off with your name so we know who you are. Also make your way to the microphone would be a good thing to add to the list, which you're not doing yet. Before you do, I just want to put it to the panel, both sides. One of the refreshing things about tonight's discussion has been it's a discussion of a how rather than a what or an if. You all talked about the question of the stain on our history, but I'm curious if the topic had been couched in slightly different terms and we'd been talking about justice rather than reconciliation. Is justice something that either of the panels feel is possible in this case? Go on, George.
Yeah. I think it's implicit in both contexts that reconciliation is about justice, so is the treaty. And, you can't have reconciliation without dealing with injustice. And a treaty is one way of dealing with those injustices.
I'm going to throw to the floor, I think. There's a question over here.
My name's Matthew, and thanks very much to all the speakers. It was amazing, and thanks to the organisers. I'm very glad the topic of a republic was eventually brought up. I was kind of waiting for it, and it was a question I had, if that was a good answer to the questions we've had tonight. So do other people on the panel have anything to comment on the topic of a republic?
I'll throw it over this side first.
Sure, look, I'm glad the Republic was mentioned as well. We haven't been talking enough about that recently, I think. But I would also say that there's a danger in us saying that the treaty debate and the Republic debate must go together. I think if that happened, there's a good chance that the conversation we need to have about our history and the things that many of the panellists have spoken about in Aboriginal Australia will get lost in a conversation about the Republic, and things such as how we appoint our president and all sorts of issues that dominated the Republic debate last time. So for me, I think it's often wise to separate out these debates lest things get conflated. And I'd also say that the experience of this country shows that if you bite off too much, well, you actually don't get anything done. And these reforms are hard, very, very hard. And if we try and do too much at the one time, even though these things are worthwhile, it's a bit like bills of rights and all sorts of things I could put on the table. But if we do too much at the one time, the odds are we get nothing. And I think this is a debate that needs to be dealt with on its own merits, and as I think the Republic should be as well.
These different big picture issues, each of them draws to itself, in a sense, a different breakdown of the Australian population in terms of interest groups and positions. And there is a certain element of a justice issue in this because, for example, if you are a recently arrived Somalian refugee, do you want to bear the history of the British Empire? I suspect not. If your family came here from Germany in 1939, do you want to bear the consequences of British colonisation in 1788, etc.? Whereas I have to say my mother's father's mother's father's father was living in Western Australia in 1838 at the time of the most bloody combat between colonists and Aboriginal people right around the southern part of the continent. I think I'm in a different position. And I'm not talking here about guilt for the deeds of the dead, so much as reconciling in my own conscience the benefits of being a descendant in this country, and on the other hand, giving back, as it were, to this topic, as I've done most of my life. But there are, in the case of the Republic, obviously people who come from republics, maybe came from the Republic of Italy in 1946, for example, might have a very different take on that and its relationship to these other issues like a treaty.
Look, just firstly, once the Republic's mentioned, and when you think of the previous attempts to discuss the Republic and referendums, it does show you, which I suppose is what is my true interest, of how do you change people to think, at least debate in a more mature way, because it's been handled so as a debacle in previous instances. And Peter just mentioned interest groups, and interest groups hijack the integrity of all public debate in Australia. So it does go to the heart of, it would be difficult to manage these two big issues at the one time because we can't manage one of them. I do want to take up just briefly something Peter said, which I think is instructive. I think we could argue about to what extent migrants do or do not feel a sense of the burden of colonisation. But one of the things I would say, and it may be about how you come to something with a different mindset, is that with all of my interactions with migrants, and I'm talking sort of post-war migrants, the Italians and Greeks I grew up with as a kid, to more recently arrived refugees, what they do come with, and maybe they don't come with that burden, but they come with a great interest and curiosity. And what you find is there is great connection between Indigenous people and some of those groups, and the energy that's come out of those discussions has been remarkably productive. And maybe something we could learn is not to say, well, we have to sort of wipe the slate to have that discussion, but at least look to the more recent arrivals and see what intelligence and what integrity and dignity they've brought to these discussions as a model white Australians, or that sense of whiteness that could be possibly dissolved a little because of that lesson?
Well, I disagree. I think that the treaty and, Aboriginal claims and rights and the Republic are one and the same issue. Australia is very narrow-minded in the way we think about issues. We like to compartmentalise things. And in fact, we are all, without sounding cliched, we are all one people. And I do think there is a lot that we have in common. And we can't, in all conscience, sign a treaty with the current apparatus of state, meaning that, the Crown essentially would have more power than any Indigenous group in any treaty that's signed or agreement at the moment. That's not going to work. That's rubbish. That's just reinforcing power imbalance. And secondly, we could not in all conscience become a republic without dealing with the Aboriginal issues that are before the nation, the Great State. They're one and the same. And this compartmentalisation is actual, it's codswallop.
I want to ask you to go on after the word codswallop, but it's such a nice note to end that answer on that I might throw to the gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Philip. One of the things that I recently attended, and thank you all for your comments and conversation this evening, it's fantastic. I recently attended the Festival of Ideas at Melbourne University, and one of the key themes that came out of it was the idea of leadership and the apparent lack of it within the current sort of political system, or the politicians that we have, or there don't seem to be the ideas there used to be. Could you make a comment about that, please?
Leadership? Well, there is none in Australia. Keating was our last decent leader, left or right. So we better do something about that pretty soon.
I think from a leadership point of view, we've been seduced to think that elected political leaders they are our representatives, or business leaders perhaps. And what we're neglecting to identify are the thousands and thousands of people who are acting in significant leadership roles all around the place in various different roles. I think we have shied away from any significant public comment on from anyone who is not a holder of official authority positions, and I think that weakens our public debate. So we can only have public debate by someone who has strong constituency, whether that be political constituency or business interest. And I think that's weakened our way that we can have political debate, and it means that we're not looking far and wide. Our peripheral vision is not wide enough to see the leadership that is happening. Now, having said that, as a bit of a critique on my own argument, part of the reason for that is that we have got it so good the last 15 years in terms of prosperity here that's like, well, why do we need to change anything? Why do we need to scratch at the edge of anything that's going on here? So a voice of critique, a voice of political agitation, we'd like that to be toned down, thanks. We'd like that to be removed. And so if our political or business leaders can provide enough public debate, then that's terrific. We'll just let that be. And it's not the call to activism, it's actually, I think, the call to the couch for many of Australians to go, oh, well, it's not going so bad, feels pretty good, and I'll just leave it at that.
Michael, I want to try and say something that we agree on so we can actually have a fighting chance in this debate. But one of the things that has always struck me as a historian is, and you mentioned at the start tonight the absence of women in this debate, and I know that was through circumstances beyond your control, but most of the work that I've done as a historian is on the letters of Aboriginal women, and I've written several essays on agitation campaigns of human rights by Aboriginal women, particularly in reserves in Victoria, namely Framlingham in the west of the state and Lake Tyers in the east of the state. If you want to look for true leadership in Indigenous communities, it's those voices, it's those women who have historically been the frontline troops, historically have taken up the arguments both at local community level and at government level. And until we have greater recognition of those leaders, those women in our community who are listened to, and we talk to people who aren't men in suits, we don't have the full gamut of interest of Aboriginal people being voiced, And when we talk, as we talk about peacemaking and truth, you can't find truth unless you hear what those women have to say and what they've had to say for over 200 years. It's fundamental to understanding colonial, post-colonial relationships in Australia.
Thank you all. We'll head back over to this side.
My name's Ruth. Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to firstly address what Dr. Sutton said about people not from Australia coming to Australia in the 40s or in the last 5 years, and their willingness to take on our history, and which I don't really understand your point, because I think that it's important to have a sense of place in the place where you live. And me, I was born here in Australia, and every single person that's born inherits a world that they didn't create, and we take on a sense of responsibility for how we're going to respond to that world. That, you know, it's not my fault. I was just born. No one has a choice about how things are when you get here, but then you have a choice about how you're going to respond to that. And because I'm born in Australia, I feel that I'm responsible for responding to the state of things in this country. And if I moved to another country, I would feel responsible for taking on the history of that place. Of every place has a history, and the history affects the reality of that place. And you can't live in any place and ignore the history of it and say, oh, that happened before I was here, whether it's before you moved there or before you were born. And it's not a matter of guilt, but because I'm not responsible for anything that happened before I was born, but it is a matter of justice, because the state of things is not just, and I was born into that situation. I have to respond to that. And so therefore, the history of this place where I live and where I was born includes a long history when only Aboriginal people lived here, and it includes a history since white people have been here. And I want to know how to live in that world and how to feel like it's just and it's right. And currently it's not, because the Aboriginal people didn't give the white people power, yet the white people have the political and financial power in this society. So that needs to be addressed. And so the question is, say, what I'm saying about a sense of place, a place has a history, and that needs to be respected by anyone who's either born there or moved there. And say if you were somebody from a very different culture moving to Australia, we as white Australia have this idea that people should learn how the culture is here and that it could be different. And I feel that the Aboriginal culture was very different than our culture is today. And so I don't think it's right to expect that Aboriginal people should become politicians and become, powerful according to how the system is at the moment, because that denies the power that they already have in existing here in their own culture. The Aboriginal people need to be given power to say what they want, so that, because it's not going to bring immediate financial gain, so the only other thing that's going to bring it about is popular opinion, and the majority of people are white. But I feel like it's hard to say, I can't prescribe what the answer is, so I need something to back.
Thank you very much.
Led by Aboriginal people.
I am sorry to cut you off. I was hanging there with you, but I think it's a strong statement. And Peter, did you want to respond?
Basically, my point was that if you have 100 or 200 years of family history in a particular place, it's not going to be the same as if you arrived yesterday on a jet. It's never going to be the same because of the depth of... what? Would you like to go to the zoo? This is a civil conversation.
Rather than... I'll just pause you there for a moment, Peter. I am delighted to have another contribution from the floor, as ever, and I will direct your attention to the microphone, which is at your disposal when you get a moment. I welcome a contribution, but we'll let Peter finish his answer.
or not?
Sorry, the distraction is leaving. My point basically was that anyone who joins a society, yes, of course, takes on, in my view, the obligation to belong, and that means understanding its history and so on. I had a son who lived in Tokyo for 10 years. He didn't take on guilt for the rape of Nanking, but he did take on the necessity to learn to speak Japanese well, which he does, and so on. That's a different kind of a contract, though, from being, say, fifth generation on both sides and born in this country, and therefore, in a sense, sharing a lot more history with other people. It is different, I think.
Thank you. I'll just... Mick?
No, I don't think that people who've come here recently, like 225 years ago, but more recent than that, and that's the period Peter's talking about. We're not asking you to feel guilty about the history. You didn't dispossess us of the land. And many of those who came 225 years came involuntarily as convicts. But most people who've come here since the convict transportation era finished have come voluntarily. And many have benefited enormously from our dispossession. So we're not asking you to feel guilty about the dispossession, but if you come here voluntarily, you have to accept the history of the place. And that original dispossession, in fact, has made it possible for you to come here and resettle. I don't think that's a big ask. You know, we didn't have any say in people coming here and imposing their worldview, their approach to things, their vision for the place. I mean, we're the involuntary ones here, not those who've come since the first dispossession started. So I don't have a great deal of sympathy for the notion that, you've got nothing to do with this. And you've got everything to do with it, because you come here and you benefit from our dispossession. You know, take some responsibility for it, not the original theft, but, you know, the ongoing dispossession is still there, hasn't been addressed. If you come to this place as a new citizen of this country, like all citizens presently here, it ought to be an obligation that you do something about what's happened to us. Because until we do that, there's going to be no reconciliation. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about it, but I'm asking you to accept responsibility for what your voluntary action's done.
Thanks, Mick. I will ask you all to keep your statements to a minute. I'm going to be quite vigilant about keeping it to that, but statements are fine. They don't all have to be questions if you don't want. Over this side.
Scott Morrison, our current immigration minister, said on Australia Day that new immigrants to Australia should exchange their old cultures and only bring what was good and adapt the current society and the values that we hold and the beliefs in Australia currently. I wonder what he would have thought if someone had told him that he needed to assimilate to Indigenous values as well. I wanted to ask, as someone who's been brought up in the Australian education system and only learned at age 15 about the genocide of the Indigenous peoples of this country, what can be done to increase understanding and what can be learnt from the Indigenous peoples of Australia, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, in order to bring the society up in the world and to help everyone grow up with a full understanding of what we are.
Thank you very much. Tony.
Firstly, Scott Morrison's an immoral person. He has certainly no right to tell new arrivals what they should leave behind, and the way that he acts certainly doesn't ascribe to any values that we should adhere to. So anything that Scott Morrison says, although he has a lot of authority, I think should be dismissed intellectually and morally. In regard to the more important issue, you ask a really big question, and it's a bit, Mick spoke earlier about the process of reconciliation taking generations. One of the things I would say, because I'm a writer and I'm involved with a lot of Indigenous writers around this country, and because I walked away from being a historian in the early 2000s after being involved in a debacle called the History Wars and debating people like Keith Wynne-Shuttle, which was again a very low-level debate with no intellectual base, all I would say is that there are Indigenous people in Australia, writers, artists, community activists, performers, filmmakers, photographers who are engaging both with aspects and diversity, true diversity of Indigenous cultures in just endless ways, and are interrogating the sorts of questions that we're asking here tonight. It's not the only thing you can do, because I think personal interaction, socialisation is the most important fundamental task that we need to consider when we want to think of turning towards people rather than turning away. But I would say to you, and particularly to young people in the audience, there is remarkable work being produced by Indigenous people across Australia that would be just a great point of beginning an educational process and a conversation and a dialogue. It's not an easy task to solve, but that's where I would begin if I were you.
I'd like to just add to that and thank yourself and the previous questioner for speaking up and asking important questions. I think there's a heap that non-Aboriginal Australians can do. My points made before were certainly about trying to overcome an us versus them mentality. But I think the work of non-Aboriginal Australia is actually to deal with racism and to educate each other. I think that's one thing you could do, is to take on anti-racism strategies, to educate your friends and family members about genocide, because the majority of Australians refuse to believe it, or think that black people are just harping on about the past and whinging all the time when we do. So I actually need non-Aboriginal Australia to take responsibility for that. I don't mean talk for us, I mean talk to each other about your own values and where you come from and what your notions of identity are. That would be a critical contribution. Aboriginal affairs should be led by us. Leave that to us and we'll work with you and ask for your help when we need it, which is often. But the work of non-Aboriginal Australia is to deal with whiteness.
George? Oh, sorry.
I'd just like to follow on from that with regard to the work on whiteness. I agree with Greg that that's a really important work that ought to be done here in Australia, and it is about understanding the privilege that goes with that. Dare I say, there's also a tremendous amount of privilege that we get as city slickers as well, and we need to remember that our backyard is a vast arid country, and so there's a lot of privilege that we have, but the privilege particularly around the whiteness and understanding that it gives you in terms of being part of the system and having the system reflect very much values that you adhere to. But I also want to acknowledge as part of that understanding history and place is also important. And the other person who was talking before about being born into this place, understanding place is important, and understanding the work that you can do around who we are and where we come from is important. We are all, after all, ancient people, and we play off this false reality that Indigenous people are very spiritual because they have proximity to their ancient wisdom, but the rest of us, well, we can just say, I'm just from Melbourne. I don't know where I'm from, really. But the reality is we have all ancient culture and ancient systems that have brought us to here, to the here and now. Imagine a conversation 200 years ago where they said, look, we want you guys to go here on Friday. And then the Aboriginal people said, that word Friday, where you get that word from? And then you'd see the white fellas would go, actually, I don't know. I don't know why we call it Friday. I don't know why we call it June. I've lost that memory. I've lost that ancient memory about how we follow the stars and the moon to calculate our days. And yet we all adhere to that blindly. And so I would encourage you to not only uncover and discover what whiteness and privilege it means, but also uncover the fact that we are ancient peoples, all of us. And we have systems that we have rolled on and adopted and accepted. And some of them are very ancient systems that we belong to, and we name it every day. And others are here distinctive that belong to the Indigenous people as well.
Sure. Look, I'll be quick so others can make a comment as well. But for me, when people ask the question, what can you do? I think the starting point is don't accept the status quo. Begin by acknowledging injustice and argue for remedies and argue for the system to be improved. And I think indeed that the fact that so many Australians acquiesce in injustice gives us often the leaders we deserve, frankly. And you've got to remember the leaders and our governments reflect our own values and our own participation, and it's no surprise to me that people like Scott Morrison are arguing the way that he is. And unless that is resisted, and unless people actually articulate and themselves see themselves as leaders in these debates and are willing to be active, then frankly I think we just acquiesce in those outcomes, and we do get the outcomes that we must share some responsibility for.
That's the meanest thing anyone's said to me in ages, that we get the leaders we deserve. Now, I'm going to take a couple in a row just so that we can get a few from the floor. So, over this side.
Hi, my name's Colin Mallett. I do some activism with the Indigenous Social Justice Association. Our primary purpose is looking into Aboriginal deaths in custody. This work has taken me into a lot of different communities, and the one really big thing that I've learned is it's not about talking, it's not about expressing your point of view, it's about listening. And that is something that we just don't do enough of. We're not listening to the elders. And so therefore, if we, say, have a vote on reconciliation or treaty and it's one vote, one value, we really, having reduced the Indigenous population to something like 2.5%, their true opinion isn't going to be brought forward properly in any referendum-style vote. So that's basically what I want to say. It's about listening.
Thank you. And immediately behind that gentleman.
Hello, I'm Em, and I'll be a newly graduated teacher, a primary school teacher, after I go home and finish off my last assignment. I just want to say that I became a teacher so I can facilitate questions like this and explorations. The recent comments by Christopher Pine about stripping the curriculum of the cross-curriculum priorities of Indigenous perspectives and histories is shocking, and also there was only one lecture, compulsory lecture, from an Indigenous person at Melbourne University that new graduate teachers are coming out into the workforce with that one lecture from actually your daughter, Erin Birch, Tony. However, not many people were at that lecture, and I'm just wondering how we can ensure that our children will be taught, will gain Indigenous perspectives regardless of government. Is treaty the answer?
Thank you. And I think that applause might be for your last bit of assessment tonight as well, so definitely deserved applause. And unfortunately only time for one more from the floor, so I better go over to this side for the last one. Sorry.
Yes, just following on from the lady, to have reconciliation, to have a treaty, you've got to know something about Australian history. We're phasing out Australian history out of the curriculum. We're interested in maths and science and money. And if I go down to Book Street Mall and say 1788 to a student, they look at me with a blank look. But if I say Twitter, they'll give me a half-hour recitation about Twitter and Facebook. They know everything about it. So what hope is there for a treaty or reconciliation if our future leaders are not going to learn anything about Australian history?
Thank you. And we will take one more over this side.
Thought you were going to kill me off there, brother. Jeff Clark. I've already been killed once, but anyway.
There's room for one more.
Yeah, right, thank you. It was encouraging to hear the terminology of the Prime Minister this morning. He described Aboriginal people as the first peoples with an S. The terminology that's too often bandied about is Indigenous Australians or First Australians. You know, you can't have a treaty with yourself, point one. If you wanted to embark on this $30 million campaign of constitutional recognition, like you've seen a display in the Parliament this morning of Aboriginal culture, you don't need constitutional change for it. If you're talking about representation, Section 121 of the Constitution, and George would know this, you can set up a state now. If you had Aboriginal leadership in the top of Australia, and plenty have been bandied about, you could set up a state, you could have 12 senators, they'd all be Aboriginals, you wouldn't need the captain's pick. So I think we need to start to clarify the arguments about just what it is that we're after. We want to be all Australians, we all want to be happy, or you want to recognise justice, recognise the Chukaba, the Aboriginal law in this country, in which this, you know, if you want to base a republic on law and culture and fairness and recognition, you've got some starting points. There's a lot of hot talk in here, but it's really not going anywhere. The question I'll pose, what would the panel say should be in a treaty? Parliamentary representation? Aboriginal land set aside? Crown lands rather than this debacle of native title? Like, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. On that note, I am going to allow our panel to respond to that and anything else from the floor as part of their summing up. They have 2 minutes each. While they're giving those summing up, you'll get your chance to vote on proceedings from tonight. You'll see some ballot boxes are doing the rounds. On your seat, you will have had a slip of paper that has for written on one side of it and against on the other, which should be fairly self-evident. If you are voting for the proposition that true reconciliation requires a treaty, put the for in the box. If you're voting against, put the against in the box. And if you remain undecided or unswayed, or have become that way through the course of this evening, don't tear it at all. Put the entire thing in the box. I now call on George Williams to sum up.
Thank you. And we've heard a bit about how Australia needs some peacemaking, we need dual sovereignty, and I agree with both of those things. I'd simply say if you want those things, a treaty is the way you achieve them. If you think about how wars have been closed in the past, they've been followed by a treaty. If you look at America and other countries where they've said we need to recognise sovereignty, it's been done by a treaty. And a treaty is the way that those things happen. As to what might actually go into a treaty, I think we start there with the recognition that Peter had that we can't remake the past, but what we can do in a treaty is start by acknowledging the past. And for me, I think education is absolutely crucial to this. I think of a treaty also through the eyes of my family. I've got a 7-year-old in primary school. I want him to learn about Aboriginal Australia, and I think a treaty would open up that conversation. It would give us something that would start us along the road to properly educating our children about the history of this country by acknowledging the truth of what has happened. And I think without truth there can be no justice. And I think a treaty is a way of starting that conversation. The other thing a treaty needs to do, though, is not just look back and to acknowledge and deal with reparations and deal with redress, but it also needs to build a platform for the future. And there, when you ask what should be in a treaty, I think part of the answer is, well, what do Aboriginal people want in a treaty? What do they want to negotiate for? What do they see as their future through a treaty? And I think the experience, as I've said overseas, is a treaty is the right way of doing this. Mutual respect through negotiation is a way of actually building the platform, if you like, a belated sense of nation building that we've never had in this country, that can finally move us beyond a system that is based literally upon discrimination and exclusion to a system that's actually based upon listening to Aboriginal people, recognising we need to build our nation upon their aspirations, not just those of the settler cultures, and the law is part of the solution to actually achieving that.
Thank you. Peter.
Something that, for me, what's come out of tonight, which seems rather concrete, I think, is that the way forward is going to have to be based on mutual understanding and mutual respect between peoples, but that can't be done in a framework of ignorance on either side. I do think, though, that we put too much emphasis on formal means of dealing with these issues, including education. Children arrive at school highly educated, not by school because they haven't been there yet. They speak a complex grammar, maybe more than one. They understand social relationships, at least the essence of kinship, friendship, having a dog. They have a culture. They have a society which has already taught them. Without a teacher, without a blackboard, sorry, I'm showing my age. I used to play as a kid in Mount Waverley when it was mainly bushland and orchards. There were no made roads around our area. I took my children back there to see where I'd partly grown up after we left Port Melbourne. My mother decided that we should get out of the ghetto, as it were, and get going. And I found that where I used to just romp around in the grass, there was a car park with gravel and a fence and a sign with a little tin under it, and the sign said, "Please pick up after your dog, penalty $100, regulation B63. I thought, well, gone are the days when you had to be morally responsible for your dog's behaviour. Now you have to do it, otherwise you'll get pinged. And that's a creeping fact about this society, is that in my lifetime I've seen things that were previously left to the realm of human decency and perhaps a little conflict every now and then. And now there is an attempt to cover almost every contingency, every possibility with a law, a regulation, a rule, a compact, a contract. I hate reading contracts. In fact, I often sign them. I normally sign them without reading them as a kind of reaction. So anyway, my basic message is big arrangements of the sort that are being talked about here have to start with little things, as Paul Kelly would say, and those little things are understanding, knowledge, historical knowledge, and not necessarily formal contracts.
Thank you. Mark?
So I've got one more T-shirt slogan. Common sense lied to me, but not anymore. This used to happen to me as a kid where my mum would say, well, common sense tells you this, and I'd look and I'd be like, I don't get it. Common sense told us that exclusion of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people was okay when we started the country. Common sense told us that to exclude them with different laws and have them put away on reserves and treated as second-class citizens, common sense told us that that was all right. Now, common sense now should be telling us that we need treaty, we need instruments that can allow us to build our relationships better. I understand the ideas that we don't need it because if we have the right spirit and if we're able to work together, we can do it. I disagree with the idea that we can remake the whole system and have dual sovereignty. That's exceedingly difficult, but then I may be limited by my own imagination. What I see is that informally, I can make it a better place and do my best to raise my family in a nice country. But I know that that's not enough. I know that we need formal instruments of authority that can allow us to all as Australians say, that's now right, that's now restored, that's the right relationship in which we can live together. Thanks.
Tony?
Thank you, Michael. I will start by addressing a couple of points that Jeff Clark made. The first one is, of course, you could not possibly, I don't think, engage in a negotiation around a treaty unless proper land rights was regarded as the most fundamental tenet of that treaty, and therefore I would suggest at the moment that's why the Australian nation, the white Australian nation, does not have the level of maturity or understanding to accept and engage in that debate, because it is so frightened and scared off the notion of proper land rights. Secondly, the point was made about constitutional recognition, and I'm not sure if it was Jeff's point, but I agree if it was his point, and if it's not, I'll state it, that I actually think it's the worst tokenistic gesture that could be ascribed to Indigenous people, and it is asking us or inviting us to sit at the foot of the colonial table, and we don't need constitutional recognition to have cultural or sovereign recognition. I actually equate this to the reception of the apology by the federal government. You might note that when the members of the government apologised, and there was tears in the parliament, and when the point was raised about compensation, monetary compensation for people who'd been abused by the state, who'd been tortured by the state, the same politicians who were in tears said, of course, it's not about money. Of course it is about money. You have the right to seek compensation if you've been abused, and not one politician could get their head around that fact. And I think these are, when it comes to real tangible outcomes, people back off. The other thing I'd say about Indigenous people need to maintain sovereign authority by voicing it. We are a sovereign people, and we demand to be recognised as a sovereign people. Those women that I talked about earlier, when they wrote their letters to government, they wrote with great politeness, but they also wrote with incredible assertiveness. They asserted their right as sovereign women. They didn't ask to be recognised, they demanded that they be recognised. And the final point I'd leave you with is taking up Mick Dodson's point about who spoke about colonial violence. I actually want to leave people with a question. And it's actually a question for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And that the question to me is, should a sovereign nation, and I mean an Indigenous sovereign nation, negotiate a treaty with another nation that treats those seeking sanctuary, in this case refugees, in such a humane manner? My point would be, until refugees are treated in a more humane manner in this country, the Australian government is not a nation that we should negotiate a treaty with.
Mick?
One thing that comes out of this discussion for me is, and the comments from the floor and what my colleagues have said up here, and particularly that last comment, is we can't leave this question to the politicians. They can't be trusted with this. I can't remember a period like recent years where fundamental freedoms and basic human rights are so threatened by our politicians. I'm glad I'm not a motorcyclist in Queensland. New South Wales and other jurisdictions, thanks to aid and interpretation by the High Court, eroding in criminal matters our right to silence. It's going to get to a stage where we'll be obliged to incriminate ourselves. And you've got a new well, he's not that new, he's been there for 2 months now, new Attorney General whose priority is to legalise hate speech. The first thing he wants to do is to amend Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act so people can get away with hateful speech. So they're not the people to entrust with both the task of constitutional change or recognition. I don't think it's entirely useless. I disagree with what some have said about that. Because if you get a prohibition of racial discrimination into the Constitution, he's about to ring the bell, I better shut up. If you get a prohibition of racial discrimination in the Constitution, is that enough? That's the question. It'll fix a lot of problems, but is that enough? Or should we abandon all this and pursue an inclusive republic, and in that process settle the issue of the issues of unfinished business and reconciliation and our ongoing relationship?
Thank you. Greg.
The parameters of the state are deeply flawed for all of us. It's a question of strategy. Do we just rely on incrementalism to make change, or do we look at systemic redress? Now, systemic redress is not going to be easy, but why are we not even trying? In South Africa, when they implemented a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they also renegotiated a new constitution for the state. That's what we need to do here. It is going to be hard, but a series of plebiscites is not such a hard thing. How did they draft the constitution in the first place? They just did it by sitting down and talking to each other. Why is that such a hard thing for us to do? We must do peacemaking first, plebiscite second, and these things must be based on renegotiating values. Who are we as a people? A recent reconciliation survey, and I think there's been a couple down now, show that Aboriginal and white Australians generally don't know each other. Apart from, the odd friend here and there, or maybe some of us are working in Aboriginal affairs, or maybe some of us come to public events at the Wheeler Centre. But essentially, Australians and Aboriginal people don't know each other. So we have to change that first, and that does require the education system to have a realistic... There's no Aboriginal history or white history, there's just history. We've got to get over the us and them business. Now, when I talked, I'm not suggesting that all white people are baddies and that Aboriginal people are, should just cast ourselves as victims. We have work to do too. We have many demons in our community that we're well aware of and that we work ourselves to the bone to deal with. But we need some space to deal with those appropriately by ourselves without non-Aboriginal people meddling. I need non-Aboriginal people to do anti-racism. You deal with the enabling environment, we'll deal with our business. And through that process of peacemaking, we will start to understand each other more. We will feel a unified, reconciled peoples. We will feel in our bones and in our metal about each other that we should have one founding document that we're both proud of. Until we do this hard work, incrementalism alone, it's incrementalism, really. It's boring. Take us another 40 years to get anywhere. 60, 80 years. Do you want your great-grandkids to be talking about the same thing? Because we were talking about the same thing 40 years ago. Grow up, Australia. The world needs us.
Seems like a nice note to end on. A big thank you to our marvellous panel of speakers tonight. A big round of applause for them. George Williams, Peter Sutton, Mark Yettica-Paulson, Tony Birch, Mick Dodson and Gregory Phillips. Before, on your way in, you were all polled as to what you thought about the topic. 33% of you on the way in were undecided. 11% were against the proposition that true reconciliation requires a treaty, and 56% were in favour of the proposition. At the end of proceedings tonight... Oh, could I also ask, could you take the bits of paper with you when you leave? Just not to leave rubbish in the hall, and also to draw out the suspense like a game show host. But that would be great if you could take those bits of paper. Post-debate, only 16% of you were left undecided after hearing our debate. 37% were against the proposition at the end of the debate, which meant it was a swing in favour of the against side, but 47% of you at the end of the debate voted that true reconciliation does require a treaty. So the for has it. But you see, everyone's a winner with that kind of result. Greg mentioned at the end there the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Often when the concept of reconciliation is talked about internationally, it's tied up with that concept of truth. And what we aim to do at the Wheeler Centre all year round and with these IQ Squared debates is to push forward discussion and conversation that we believe should be happening and should be happening more. If you've enjoyed today and you want to spread it to other people, go to wheelercentre.com. The video of it will go up there, and go and try and get more people engaged in the conversation. Thank you.